I'm Dave Breakenridge, and this is Under the Dome. After a busy few weeks at the Alberta legislature, the session has wrapped up, meaning we're just a couple months away from the expected May election. Today on Under the Dome, we will look at some of the highlights of the session, some issues for the government around medication procurement and an oil sands tailings leak. Plus, we'll talk about what you can expect as both parties gear up for a hard-fought campaign. My guest today, again, we have Edmonton Journal legislature reporters Lisa Johnson and Matthew Black. Thanks very much for joining us. Look, it's been a busy couple weeks. It's been a busy month at the legislature, and we actually wrapped up the legislature session this week. It was a short but eventful session. Lisa, what were the main highlights for you? Other than, we talked about the budget last time, but what were some of the big highlights under the actual dome at the legislature?
Yeah, well, there were only 5 government bills that were passed this session in just a few weeks. So they really were in and they were out. 2 of those bills were omnibus bills. So a bunch of different legislative changes all wrapped up in one kind of big package. And obviously a lot of that legislation was designed to give the UCP MLAs material for the campaign trail, right? They passed a bill aiming to wrest control over gun regulation from Ottawa. They created subsidies for families to be able to adopt more easily in the province. And as we talked about last time, I mean, the budget itself was a big feature of this session. They bumped up healthcare spending by about 4%. And they, as you know, they put billions of dollars into things like affordability checks, in part because they're sitting on a $2.4 billion surplus. So those were some of the things that the UCP was focused on. We didn't see them use the Sovereignty Act in any way, shape, or form, nor did we see them pushing on a provincial police service or pulling out of the Canada Pension Plan, which are generally red meat issues for their base. But that kind of gives a hint as to what they will and will not be talking about. They'll be talking about affordability and their efforts to fix the healthcare system, I think, as we approach the election. And of course, for the opposition NDP, a big focus was healthcare and healthcare issues, and the controversial R-Star program, which I think has been renamed the Liability Management Incentive Program, which hasn't been fully funded yet, but proposes as a pilot project to spend $100 million in essentially giving tax incentives to oil and gas companies that clean up their wells, their inactive oil and gas wells, right? Mm-hmm. And in part, some of the government's response to that criticism from the NDP meant that we saw a new directive just recently that means oil and gas companies who have unpaid property taxes won't get new licenses to drill, although there have been some questions about the thresholds there. So it's been an interesting back and forth on some really key issues that both parties, I think, are zeroing in on ahead of the election, which we expect on May 29th.
Yeah. And as it's it was the session wrapped up, the last session before we go into an election, it means it will be the last time we see some familiar faces down at the legislature. I know that some MLAs, and we've done stories about them opting not to run again. Tracy Allard is kind of one of the big UCP cabinet ministers who's announced that she's not running again. But who else are we saying goodbye to? What politicians on both sides of the aisle have kind of said, I've had enough?
Yeah, you mentioned Tracy Allard is not going to be running for re-election. I mean, there are some MLAs who've been at the legislature for 8 years, 2 terms or more. On the UCP side, Mark Smith, Tanny Yao, Calgary Fish Creek MLA Richard Gottfried is not running for re-election, and even Cabinet Minister Rajan Sawhney, who ran for the UCP leadership, they won't be running again. We also obviously just learned this morning that Finance Minister Travis Taves is stepping away, which we expected he might do. He ran for leadership. He's been the finance minister for the entire UCP term, was considered part of former Premier Jason Kenney's close circle. He's not going to be running again in the election. So there's lots of big gaps there. And on the NDP side, we've got a few MLAs stepping away as well. Longtime MLA Darren Billis is bouncing over to the private sector. John Carson, who was, I think, the youngest MLA the NDP had on their side, of the House. He's not running for re-election. We also know Chris Nielsen won't be running for re-election. He didn't get his nomination. So there's going to be a fair amount of changeover when the election finally shakes out. And there were some emotional goodbyes this week in the House where we actually saw some real civility where both sides of the House expressed a lot of graciousness to the other side for their work and their dedication to serving the public, which is what they came here to do.
Mm-hmm. Now, I mean, looking at this session, there were a lot of attempts by the government to really burnish their record, to polish things up a little bit, to make it look like they're ready for an election. We had a very positive budget. You know, there was a lot of spending. We talked about that on the last episode. We're in a surplus position. They're putting money into healthcare and education. But Matthew, it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows for the government this term, and some of it involved some past decisions. You had some stories relating to the procurement of children's medication, and this goes back to the fall. The fact that the government had, you know, when there were shortages on the shelves of children's medication, the government decided to step in and say, well, Health Canada is not helping us out. You know, we need to do this on our own. We have great supply chain management here. So we're going to go out and we're going to source some kids' medication. And so what do we learn recently about the province's procurement of that medication?
Well, we probably learned that it's not quite as simple as that, is it? You mentioned that it goes back to October, November time when it's cold and flu season. COVID is still hanging around. I'm a parent of 2 kids. When my kids got sick, then it was very difficult to find this children's pain medication. So they were trying to address this during a time of a nationwide shortage. It's taken a few months, but it's finally here. 250,000 bottles of imported children's acetaminophen are now available in your local pharmacy behind the counter. But it's not your typical pain medication. And the government didn't play this up much in their announcement earlier. But a few days before, I found a document, a memo to pharmacists. So it indicated the new imported medication, it's called Peril, has a concentration that's about 25% less than your normal children's Tylenol, your normal children's medication you get on store shelves. So what that means if you're a parent is you might have to use more of it or buy more of it to get the same dosage as you would a traditional brand. This also means you have to be very careful to how you administer it, because if you use the imported medication with the normal dosing spoon, you can have problems, and as well as the other way around. So this is why it's being kept behind the counter, because pharmacists need to walk parents through how to use it and how to measure those doses properly. And it's a mild annoyance, some pharmacists have told me, who now have to take the time to have those discussions with parents rather than simply point to the store shelves like it's over there. But if you wanted this, it also affects their schedule a bit, because if you wanted this, let's say, you might not be able to get it late at night because not all pharmacies are 24 hours. You can't just go to the Rexall or Shoppers, that's 24 hours. There might not be a pharmacist on. And it's not clear if parents will actually buy this. Is anecdotally, again, parent of 2 children, most pharmacies that I've been to recently don't appear to be facing that severe shortage we saw a few months ago. The health minister says there are some shortages still in some parts of the province, and they'll point to that. But generally, it appears that the shortage that we saw last fall, early winter, has largely abated.
Yeah, and the other piece of this is the amount that we were bringing in and the amount that we spent on bringing it in. And I wonder, how is the province going to address that? If there aren't shortages on pharmacy shelves, drugstore shelves, you would figure that they wouldn't need to stock this medication, this imported medication, that there may be a surplus of that medication sitting around somewhere. Is the province looking to potentially sell it to other jurisdictions to try and recoup some of the costs that it incurred in going on this kind of hunt, this international hunt for medication?
Yeah, absolutely. That's part of the plan. That's part of the business plan here. The province spent $80 million on this purchase. $70 million of that was for the medication. The other $10 million was for transportation, administration, waste disposal. But yeah, part of the plan is to recoup some of that by selling it to other provinces. And given the dosage issue and given the shortage appears to be over in many parts and the federal government keeps importing more and more, I got a bit curious about just how badly these other provinces would want it. So I picked up the phone and got in touch with the the other 9 provinces' health ministries, as well as that of the 3 territories, to get a sense of demand. I heard back from all of them except for 2, PEI and Yukon, and only Saskatchewan, among those who did reply, indicated it might possibly be interested in purchasing some of the medication. They actually said that government of Alberta officials have been in touch with their health ministry, but they were still hedging their bet. There's very clear there's no deal yet. So demand doesn't appear high. Most provinces basically cited that our current supplies are good. We expect it to grow more in the future. And BC's health ministry told it was especially concerned about the lower dosage, which it noted introduced a significant risk of dosing errors, something you obviously want to avoid with small children. So maybe things will change next fall, winter, next flu season when we get back into that. But as of right now, it looks like it's going to be a pretty tough sell for the government of Alberta to pitch this on to other provinces.
Yeah. Now, turning our attention to an issue that's kind of been bubbling in the background of the political landscape over the last few weeks has been the controversy around the Curl site. This is an oil sands facility up north run by Imperial Oil. And there was a leak that several months ago that wasn't exactly announced, as it were. There were people who feel that they weren't told about this leak in a timely fashion. Lisa, what can you tell me about the back and forth and kind of what's at the heart of the controversy in this case?
Yeah, so this goes all the way back to May of last year when a tailings pond at the Curl site had a leak. And what ended up happening is all this arsenic, dissolved heavy metals, hydrocarbons leaked out of the containment pond, and local communities said they weren't told about it until February. So there's obviously been a lot of anger, particularly from First Nations communities that are downstream from this site. And of course, the issue of whether or not the government, the Alberta Energy Regulator, and Imperial Oil, whether or not they should have been notifying people earlier has been top of mind since this story broke. But most recently this week, of course, a Calgary lawyer instigated a complaint to the province's Information and Privacy Commissioner, arguing that under Alberta law, the Alberta Energy Regulator should have notified the public earlier about the potential risk that this leak posed. And so what we learned this week is that the Information and Privacy Commissioner is going to investigate how the Alberta Energy Regulator dealt with it. Of course, the Environment Minister, former Energy Minister Sonia Savage, has said that the government welcomes that investigation. They want to learn whether or not processes were followed, whether or not the processes need to be improved. But meanwhile, there's a lot of anger on the ground up in this area because, we've heard First Nations communities describe this situation as an environmental racism, and so there's a lot of animosity and concern, not just from them, but also from the government of the Northwest Territories. Right, the Northwest Territories has an agreement with Alberta to communicate these kinds of things, and they say they weren't properly communicated with. Of course, since we learned this in February, Imperial Oil has said that it's doing everything it can to contain it and do cleanup. And of course, the province, the federal government is also involved, and they're working on monitoring whether or not any of the toxic materials have gotten into drinking water, for example, or if they've affected wildlife. We know that some of these compounds are quite harmful to wildlife, but so far the province is saying that their officials have not found any seepage into drinking water for now.
So what will the Information and Privacy Commissioner be looking into? Will it be whether Imperial Oil lived up to its responsibilities, whether the province followed its procedures, and kind of what will that investigation look like?
It's more focused on the Alberta Energy Regulator and what the Alberta Energy Regulator's obligations were. Did it have the obligation to communicate this to the public earlier? And did it fulfill that obligation, if that obligation did exist? Right now, it doesn't involve Imperial Oil per se, and there's no timeline that the commissioner has given, and no real promise to release the report necessarily. We might see it, we might not, but there are still some unanswered questions as that goes forward.
Mm-hmm. All right, now changing topic, but sticking with oil. As people remember, in late February, the province brought down its budget, which landed us with a couple $2 billion in surplus cash. And part of that is largely due to, as people will know in Alberta, the provincial government forecasts the price of oil, and it's an average price for the year. But changes in the price of oil, even by $1 a barrel, can have huge impact on Alberta's bottom line. And the price of oil has been softening recently. And Matthew, you looked into this issue and the potential impact on Alberta's bottom line. And you spoke with the finance minister just before session earlier in the week. What did he have to say about the impact that the price of oil could potentially have on what he billed as a sound fiscal plan for the province?
Well, there's kind of two answers. There's the short-term answer and there's the long-term answer. So I asked the finance minister, Travis Toews, and he told me he's well aware of the volatility of oil markets. We all are. And he pointed that February's budget, his budget 2023, it used a pretty conservative estimate for oil prices, one that he says was lower than most private sector forecasts by between $5 to $7. And he also pointed out that the province has a contingency fund, which sits at $1.5 billion. So there's a bit of cushion in there, right? That is not to say, though, it has no impact. And economist Trevor Toome, University of Calgary, told me that for every $1 change in the price of oil, it has an impact of over $600 million on the province's bottom line. And just the way the budget is structured, that impact can grow in the years to come. That if things hold the same, which is a big assumption, it could go up to $1 billion impact for every dollar in the next 3 to 4 years. So that would mean right now, using today's numbers, we'd face a $3 billion deficit instead of a $2.3 billion surplus that we announced back in February on budget day. Over the longer term, oil prices will continue to have big influence on the province's bottom line. We know that they're volatile. We know that they change often. So that bottom line probably will change as well. So the roller coaster ride on oil prices continues. We don't know if it's going to go up or down. World factors influence it that we have no control over here. And the only way off it, economists say, is to diversify revenue. And that probably includes some form of higher taxes, something that not a lot of people or politicians probably have a big appetite for right now.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, we're through the session. As mentioned, it was a short one, a busy one. For the next couple months, it's going to be talk about the election, even though we're not in a formal writ period, and that'll come in about a month's time. Lisa, for you, what kind of things are you paying attention to as we approach the election? Do you expect, a lot of promises from the government, or are they kind of hamstrung by the fact that they've tabled a budget that spells out a lot of spending for them? And, what do you expect from the NDP?
So Premier Danielle Smith has been really focused on what she calls compassionate conservatism. I mean, it's easy to be compassionate when you've got a huge surplus, but she's been particularly focused on the government's healthcare reform efforts. She fired the board of the Provincial Health Authority and replaced it with an interim commissioner, Dr. John Cowell. And she says that his work has resulted in reduced surgical wait times. It's lessened ambulance bottlenecks. It's making an incremental difference in some of these things that are really squeezing the healthcare system right now. But of course, the NDP will continue to needle the UCP's track record on health. They'll remind people of the war on doctors, back early on before the pandemic, the contract dispute, the damage done to the system during the COVID-19 pandemic. But of course, you have to remember, the healthcare system is a dynamic machine that consistently sees challenges, right? Like earlier this week, I reported on some concerns that staff have at the Misericordia Hospital that the CT scanner is unreliable. And this affects patients on the ground. So somebody coming to the hospital who needs a CT scan, having to wait longer than arguably they should. When that happens, when the experience of patients doesn't match up with what the government's message is about, we're fixing healthcare, we're lessening these wait times in emergency rooms. When that doesn't line up, it could really become a political problem for Smith. And so those are going to be the healthcare kind of issues that the NDP are focusing on. And I think both parties, too, will have a dedicated focus on Calgary and wooing Calgary voters, right? I mean, the NDP has been quite adamant that there's nothing in this budget that is really targeted towards revitalization in downtown Calgary. There are some projects that the UCP is committed to that are Calgary adjacent, but the downtown revitalization piece is something that they're really, really focused on. So it'll be interesting to see how the UCP targets Calgary voters and what kind of messaging they bring to that city, because of course we're expecting it to be the main battleground in the next election.
Mm-hmm. And Matthew, last word to you on this. What are you kind of expecting, or what are you anticipating in the weeks to come as we head in toward the writ period?
Yeah, just to echo what Lisa said, it's very much a case of battleground Calgary, as the consensus seems to be that the UCP has a very strong hold on rural Alberta. The NDP has a strong hold on the capital city here in Edmonton, and that leaves Calgary kind of with all to play for. So it's a very simple analysis, but it seems to be the correct one if you kind of stack up the numbers and tally them all up. But I'm keeping some eye on some Edmonton area ridings that might be up for grabs. Edmonton Southwest, it's now held by Deputy Premier Casey Madhu. That could be something of a swing seat because he's been involved in a couple scandals. There's questionable popularity there, so we'll have to see how he fares. So too could ridings in Sherwood Park and the St. Albert areas as well. Party officials on both sides have actually told me they think those two will be very competitive, and so possible pickups for either party there. Let's not forget about Southern Alberta. Drew Barnes hasn't said he's not running in a Medicine Hat area riding. He's just not running as a UCP member. But his presence there could result in a vote split and an opportunity for the NDP to pick up a seat there too. We both know what the big picture strategies are for the parties. The NDP will focus on healthcare and basically being not the UCP, whereas the UCP will try to focus on their business front approach, job creation, the energy industry, the familiar strokes we've seen from them before. So the next couple of weeks, couple months will be how they can get those to voters, how they can pitch those plans to voters, particularly in the Calgary area, because that's where a lot of the focus will be.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's fascinating time, as always, in Alberta politics. Happy to borrow you for 20 minutes or so to discuss some of the goings on. Lisa, Matthew, thanks again.
Happy to do it.
Thanks, Dave.
That's it for another episode of Under the Dome. Don't forget you can find all past episodes at edmontonjournal.com/underthedome, or you can hit that subscribe button on YouTube. I'm Dave Breakenridge. We'll see you next time.